drawing and painting, what we're going to go over today is doing a watercolor landscape. So our next unit is watercolor landscapes. This one is just a practice to get you into the entire style of working in a watercolor landscape. We're going to kind of do a step-by-step Bob Ross style today. You can follow along on the PowerPoint if you want. You can follow along on the video. You can go back and forth. Totally up to you how you want to go through the process. You should have paper in your bin that is watercolor paper. You might have a full sheet size. This is just a half sheet size. Some of you got different supplies. If you have like the full 8x12 sheet, you're gonna want to cut it in half so you're working in just a half size style. You don't want to do this on a giant sheet. So the slideshow goes through everything step by step, gives you written directions, it gives you picture directions of what you're going to do. So what I'm going to do is show you a video. Where did my face go? Wrong thing. We're going to show you a video of the process. Let's see if my face stays. It does not stay. I want you to see my face. So this video is going to go step by step, and I'm going to commentate over the video. Watercolor landscape, step by step. So supplies you need are, you need a small sheet of watercolor paper, watercolor palette, so that's just like your watercolor guy that you have. They all look different. Paintbrushes, grab all your paintbrushes. You should have at least 3. A water cup, so I have my clean cup and my dirty cup. So one is for rinsing brushes, one is for getting clean water to dab out of your stuff. Some of you might have gotten a blue bin that has separator in the center. If you don't fill it up past that separator, one side is for clean, one side is for dirty. Paper towel or tissue, I prefer tissue, whatever you have. Even toilet paper works. And then optional but super helpful is a form of tape. Masking tape, painter's tape, washi tape. You could try Scotch tape and see what happens. I haven't. But those are the supplies you're going to need to work on the project today. And that's basically everything. So, first things first. You can see I have my paper taped down to my table that I'm working at. And then I'm working with a really light pencil to draw out the design you're going to paint. Think about splitting the page into 3 sections. So you should have, for sectioning, it should be background, which is your sky, midground, which is going to be your mountains, and foreground, which is going to be your grass and trees. They should be relatively equally split. So kind of third, third, third. It's a little bit off. That's totally fine. Call it the rule of thirds or the golden ratio. So that's kind of what you want to go with. Make sure you're using a really light pencil, so like a 2H, an HB, or an H or an F for this. If you have watercolor pencils, that's like really handy because they'll just dissolve away. Mine, I had to draw a little bit darker just so you could see it. So in my final product, like especially on my mountains, like my top, let's see, this is backwards to me, my top mountain, you can actually still see my pencil mark because it's darker than my paint, which isn't ideal. I could actually probably go back and try and erase it through the watercolor. But you shouldn't have that problem if you draw light enough. I just had to draw dark enough so you could actually see. The paper is kind of reflective on the screen. So I kind of just like went with whatever for my mountains. You can look at a reference photo if you want, like a real mountain system. I kind of just did 3 little sections of mountains. If you wanted to do more, you could. If you want to do like little peaks, you could. Be however creative you want with this, or follow exactly to the detail of the step-by-step in the slideshow. And then I tried to go back and erase like really dark lines or extra lines that didn't need to be there. Then the first thing you're going to do is when you're painting with watercolors ever, you always want to paint from, like this is the lid of my watercolor thing, and these are my watercolors. Never paint directly from here. If you do, your colors are probably going to be too dark and they're going to be really uneven as you're painting. You want to make enough, like you can see my paint has dried in here from the grasses I did. You want to make enough paint in here to apply to the section that you're working on. So as you can see here, I'm just putting plain water in there right now so that I can make a big enough puddle of water to do the background wash, so my sky wash. For your sky wash, you could do one color gradient, you could do one color flat wash, you could do a gradient into another color, so you could go from like yellow to orange to red, whatever you wanted to do. Or you want to do a night sky, you could go really dark. I don't know what there's mountains, but like, hey, go for it, see what happens. This is totally experimental. So when you're creating a wash, the best kind of brush to use really is like a flat brush. So you should have gotten a brush that maybe looks, let me find it, like this guy. He's flat on top instead of pointy. You should have like a little bit of both these. Flat ones are better for making washes. The pointy ones are better for making the trees and the grasses. Kind of work from the top down. You can see I kind of go back over it. If you want a really soft effect, if you just lightly wet the paper down first, not like saturate it, like not a lot, it gets crazy then. But if you lightly wet the paper with just plain water, it'll smooth your color on really easy, and it gives you kind of a soft effect. Because we're working in such a light color for the background, or at least I am on this one, and they suggest that, it's not too harsh. You can see kind of some of my lines. I guess you can't see me pointing to the camera. You can see some of my lines up here, but it wasn't too bad. So after I applied my wash, while it was still a little bit wet, I took a tissue and I dabbed away some clouds. It kind of gives you a little bit of variation in your sky. And then I decided I dabbed too much clouds away because this is like really distant, and so I made my clouds littler, gave myself a little bit of variation in my cloud color. So my clouds over here are a little bluer. That's just a technique, and it's called lifting while wet. So when your background is still wet and you lift color away from it, you're lifting while it's still wet, and you kind of maintain some of that whites again. You bring those back. It's a good way to make clouds. But again, don't feel like you have to do a flat wash. You can do a gradient, you can experiment, you can do a sunset. The world is yours. So now the next thing I'm going to do is create a light color for my background mountain. Atmospheric perspective states that things in the distance, so farther away, are 1, lighter in color, 2, they're in less detail, and 3, they're sometimes bluish or like purplish almost. So the farther away something is, the lighter for sure it should be. The closer it gets to you, the more saturated or darker it gets, and the more in detail it gets. So my background mountain, I think in the example they're blues. I went with grays. So I have a little gray, like light gray color here, and I'm kind of going back and forth over it a little bit. I'm trying to create some areas that maybe are a little darker, some areas a little lighter, but it's mostly a flat wash for that back mountain because again, it's in the distance, there's not a lot of detail. You may want it to dry for a second, and you can see this happen to me exactly right here. It doesn't take long for this paint to dry on here, especially if you don't oversaturate it too much. I should have waited for a second so I could have gotten a crisper line between my front mount and my back. I think I did go back and fix it. But because this was still wet, wet on wet happened. So my little mount, my front mountain here, bled into my background mountain. So maybe let this one dry a little bit before you apply your second layer. And I just mixed up a little bit of a darker gray. I actually used that same puddle and just added more pigment to it. And then I wanted this to look a little bit more detailed, so I wanted to add a little bit of highlights, a little bit of lowlights, and again, I was like, I don't want to take too much out, so I just kind of went back in and gave some variation. And the last one, I added a little bit more black to my color, and that first foreground one is darker. And at first I went with like a really straight line in front, and then I was like, oh, this looks like not right. So I go back in and add a little bit of variation at the bottom so it's not so straight across. And again, I'm trying to create some areas that are a little bit darker, some areas that are a little bit lighter, and I'm going through and instead of drop painting like this, I'm kind of painting up and down a little bit, and I'm trying to create some detail in the mountain edge so it's a little bit chunkier. I create a little bit of variation in color in it so that it's got a little bit more detail in it than the ones that are in the background. Because again, as they come closer, they should be a little bit more in focus. Next thing I'm going to do is just create a light wash of green color in the foreground. It's really light, it's very sparse. It's just so that the trees that you're going to apply on top of it have something in the background instead of white. So now what I'm doing is mixing up the color for my trees. I want to go with kind of washed out. So you can see I have two puddles here. One is kind of my darker color and one is my lighter color. So I'm going to take my little pointed brush and I'm just going to kind of add like shadowy colors of that lighter green color. And those are like kind of like my background pine trees. And then I go back and add a little bit of variation. I dab like a little brown in my brush, a little bit darker color, so it's not just like one swash of a color. Just to give a little bit of variation in those like really, really far distance background trees. And again, they're lighter in color. And then I go through with a darker color and I start adding my little pine trees that are in the front. You don't want them to all be lined up in a row. Kind of do some high, some low, overlap some. You could make like areas that have a really concentration, some areas that are open. And then I realized that maybe I went a little too dark in the front, so then I actually made a lighter color again and went back and forth in the front and back. Just to create some variation in distance and size and saturation and color. And that good jazz for like making my trees. And you don't have to go pine trees if you don't want. You could do something else. Totally up to you for the style of tree that you want to work in. Or if you want to do flowers instead, like say you want to have a flower field in the front, you could work those colors from back to front. And you could choose a totally different color scheme if you wanted to. Now, since I've got the background of my foreground, sounds funny, done. I've got that light, medium, and now I'm going to do what's the closest. So the grass is the closest to me, so it's actually going to be the most in focus. So the grass blades might look really big, but it gives you the idea that you're sitting right in the grass, and then everything else in the background is far away. So I've mixed up like 3 or 4 different colors actually. So the first color I did was kind of like a lightish yellow-green color for the grass. And I'm just working and kind of creating those blades up. You don't want to start and work down. You want to start from the base and kind of brush upward, kind of like flicking almost. No, not flicking, but like you want the top to be pointed. So it looks like so it looks actually like a piece of grass. So I start here and kind of just lift off the paper. So you can see that one, oh, big blade of grass. But I go back and forth between like 4 different colors. Now here is where I do something stupid, right here. Don't, when you're done, for one, let it dry completely. If there is wet paint on the paper, it will more likely rip your paper off. Let's go back just like a smidgen here. This first one I did a great job. I go to peel my tape off and I'm peeling it away from the paper, away from the center of the paper. I'm kind of peeling down and away. This one I peel up towards the paper and I instantly ripped my paper. So here, watch on the top, I'm gonna kind of peel up and away. And you can see it does peel a little bit off that fiber off, it's fine. But as long as you're peeling down and away, it should rip off relatively clean. Just never rip towards your actual image. Now you can see the details of my little Bob Ross landscape painting. Jazz fingers at the end there. This is just a practice. Do not stress over this being perfect. If you do it wrong, just do it on the back side again. Let it dry and do it on the back side. Don't use another sheet of paper for it. And don't feel like you have to turn in something that's perfect. I don't expect that at all. This is just practice. I don't mean like wobbly dobbly, but like this is going to lead up to what your project's going to be. So it's a good step-by-step practice. Don't rush through it. This is a 6-minute video that has been sped forward. It took me 25 minutes to make this. So it should take you maybe 40 minutes. You have to let things dry in between a little bit. Shouldn't be too long of a wait. But don't stress over it too much. Watercolor can be really hard to control. Start with less water first and then see how it goes from there. Otherwise, yay! That is all I have for you for today.